What you're about to hear isn't speculation or the stuff of science fiction. It's a verified, world-changing event that has upended everything we thought we knew about space and the laws of physics. On March 5th, 2026, at exactly 8 a.m. Universal Time, something happened that sent shockwaves through the scientific community, shaking even the most seasoned astronomers and defense agencies to their core. In a split second, they all came to the same chilling conclusion. The rules of space and physics no longer applied. This moment, now etched in history, began with a discovery from NASA's Goldstone Deep Space Communications Complex. They detected an object traveling through the vastness of interstellar space, initially cataloged as 3I Atlas. At first glance, it seemed like just another rogue object drifting silently between the stars. But that assumption didn't last long. Radar data soon revealed a massive, unexpected spike in the object's cross-section, something entirely out of the ordinary, sending ripples of confusion and intrigue across every expert team involved. This wasn't a random object. The probability of what followed happening naturally was calculated to be exactly 0, and what followed left scientists, experts, and the entire world reeling in disbelief. In a span of 14 seconds, this massive 3 billion-ton object didn't fragment in the chaotic, expected manner like asteroids and comets do. There was no explosive shattering, no debris cloud, no typical signs of destruction. Instead, it broke into 50 perfectly symmetrical pieces, each fragment stabilized instantly, and formed a rigid geometric formation defying the second law of thermodynamics. This wasn't just an astronomical object, it was something far more complex, and the real question soon shifted. Why were 50 city-sized fragments now descending toward Earth, each aligning precisely with a specific location on the planet? For those familiar with classical mechanics, fragmentation like this isn't an anomaly. Take Shoemaker-Levy 9, for instance, a comet that famously tore itself apart under Jupiter's tidal forces. When large objects are pulled apart by gravity, the result is typically a messy, unpredictable trail of debris scattered in every direction. This chaotic process produces what scientists call a string of pearls, but 3I Atlas didn't follow that script. It defied expectations in every possible way. Instead of random fragmentation, these pieces were ejected with violent force, but immediately synchronized in velocity and position, snapping into an exact formation as if they were part of a much larger and highly organized system. Imagine 50 independent pieces, each moving at speeds exceeding 100,000 miles per hour, yet behaving as one coherent system with millimeter-level precision. Rocks don't fly in formation, and nature doesn't create perfect grids. To achieve this level of coordination, each fragment would need its own propulsion system and a communication method capable of bridging vast interstellar distances in an instant. Could this imply the presence of quantum entanglement, a phenomenon where systems share information instantaneously, regardless of the distance between them? While it seems like a stretch, it's one of the few plausible explanations. If true, it suggests that the creators of 3I Atlas were operating beyond planetary scales, possibly even manipulating space-time itself. As the formation of 50 fragments continued to approach Earth, another anomaly was detected. The James Webb Space Telescope recorded identical infrared signatures from each piece. Every fragment had the same mass, same shape, and identical thermal profile. In natural fragmentation, you would expect some variation in size and temperature. Larger fragments would be hotter, while smaller ones would cool faster. But that's not what was observed. These pieces weren't the result of a random cosmic event. They were deliberately engineered. 50 identical, perfectly crafted objects produced with a level of precision that made it clear they were not just debris, they were created with purpose. Even more perplexing was the way these objects were moving. According to orbital mechanics, changing an object's trajectory requires energy, and that energy typically results in detectable exhaust or radiation. But observatories worldwide found no evidence of such emissions. These fragments were maneuvering silently, with no visible propulsion, no heat signature, no exhaust. The only reasonable explanation appeared to be magnetic sailing or gravitational manipulation methods that defy conventional physics. The fragments seemed to be using stellar field lines to propel themselves, bypassing the conventional rules of motion entirely. As they continued to advance, they began to emit gravitational ripples, something that shouldn't happen under normal circumstances. Gravitational waves are typically generated by extremely massive objects like black holes or neutron stars. For something of this size to generate such waves suggested that these fragments weren't just traveling through space, they were tethered into space-time itself, as if part of an even larger system. As the fragments continued their silent, controlled approach toward Earth, more anomalies emerged. One of the most unsettling discoveries came from radar logs at NASA's Goldstone station. Each of the 50 fragments was emitting low-frequency gravitational ripples. In space, such gravitational waves are typically the result of incredibly dense objects like black holes or neutron stars, bodies with mass concentrations far beyond anything we would expect from smaller space debris. For objects of this size to generate such signals meant their density exceeded what we know about matter. These objects weren't simply moving through space, they were anchored into the very fabric of space-time itself. When the trajectory confirmation data arrived from European space agencies, the situation took another strange turn. The fragments weren't converging on a single location. Instead, they were spreading out, aligning themselves across the entire globe. Every major tectonic plate, every continent, they were positioning themselves over specific, carefully chosen spots on Earth. This was no random occurrence. This wasn't a simple asteroid impact heading our way. No, this was strategic positioning. But what made this even more disturbing was a final, curious transmission intercepted just before the fragmentation occurred. It was a focused burst aimed squarely at Antarctica, directed at a location known as the Ice Cube Neutrino Observatory. Neutrinos, often called ghost particles, are capable of passing through entire planets without being affected, making them an ideal medium for sending messages through solid matter. What's most significant here is the fact that this signal wasn't just aimed at Earth, it was directed with intent, with the kind of precision you might expect from something trying to ensure we heard it. This wasn't an ordinary transmission, it was a message meant to guarantee that nothing would stand in the way of communication. The fragments, it seemed, were not only aware of us, they were actively engaging with our planet. As the fragments drew closer to Earth, it became increasingly clear that this wasn't just an object passing through our solar system, it was a system, one designed for Earth itself. The countdown that had begun wasn't some far-off theoretical event anymore. With just 64 hours remaining before the first fragment would brush against Earth's outer exosphere, the situation had shifted from mystery to undeniable certainty. Every major monitoring station on Earth was now focused on the incoming formation, and what they were seeing was far more unsettling than any scientist had predicted. These fragments weren't behaving like passive objects. They weren't drifting, they were accelerating. Yet, strangely, no heat was detected, no thermal emissions, no sign of conventional propulsion. In physics, this is a contradiction. Motion without heat is impossible by our current understanding of thermodynamics. The fragments were colder than the cosmic background itself, an anomaly that no natural object could produce. This led to one of the most shocking conclusions. These fragments weren't burning fuel. They weren't emitting exhaust. They were drawing energy from the very fabric of space-time, utilizing what's known as entropic inversion, converting internal heat directly into momentum without any waste. In layman's terms, they were manipulating energy on a scale far beyond our understanding, suggesting that they were not just advanced objects, but part of an advanced Type 2 civilization, one that could control stellar energy. The implications were staggering. These fragments weren't following the usual rules of physics. They weren't breaking up, they weren't moving erratically, and they weren't emitting the expected signatures of a natural object. They were doing something entirely new, something that could only be explained by an intelligence far beyond anything humanity had encountered. And with each passing minute, the fragments got closer to Earth. As the first fragments crossed Mars's orbital threshold, their speed increased, yet they remained as cold as the void of space itself. They weren't burning fuel, they were harvesting energy from the very space they were traveling through. This was no ordinary cosmic event. No asteroid, no comet. These objects were part of something far greater, a system that wasn't just moving through our solar system. It was manipulating the very nature of space-time as it approached Earth. Stay tuned, because the mystery deepens, and what comes next will shake the foundation of everything we think we know about the universe. As the 50 fragments drew closer to Earth, the anomalies intensified. It wasn't just their movement or the lack of heat signatures that defied conventional science. They were starting to interact with Earth in ways that completely broke our understanding of space and physics. The first signs of this came when the European Space Agency's Gaia mission tracked the gravitational influence of the fragments. What they found was nothing short of perplexing. Each fragment emitted a stable microgravitational pull directed toward Earth's surface. This alone was odd, given the relatively small size of the fragments compared to planets or stars. But what made it even stranger was how synchronized this pull was. These microgravitational forces weren't random. They were organized, forming a specific and intentional pressure map over Earth's fault lines, subduction zones, and rift valleys, the very places where seismic energy builds up. This wasn't just some cosmic coincidence. These fragments weren't just hovering above Earth, they were actively monitoring and positioning themselves over the planet's most sensitive areas. These were places of high tectonic stress, areas where seismic energy builds up before being released as earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. The fragments were precisely placed to influence the tectonic stresses of the Earth. They weren't just observing, they were interacting on a geophysical level. What was truly astonishing, though, was the realization that these fragments weren't just here to monitor Earth's geology. They were potentially capable of controlling it. If these fragments could adjust local gravity, even slightly, they could influence tectonic movements in real time. In other words, they had the potential to regulate the planet's seismic activity, stabilizing fault lines, preventing catastrophic eruptions, or even subtly shaping the planet's surface. This was not the kind of interference we had imagined from space objects. These fragments weren't merely passive observers, they were active participants in the planet's geophysical processes. Meanwhile, the neutrino pulses coming from the Ice Cube Neutrino Observatory became increasingly complex. Initially, these pulses had been simple, evenly spaced bursts. But as the fragments continued to approach and stabilize, the rhythm of the pulses began to change. They no longer followed a predictable pattern. They became increasingly sophisticated. It was as if these signals were no longer just trying to communicate from afar. They were being used to actively map the Earth's interior. Neutrino tomography, a technique that uses neutrinos to peer deep inside planets without interference, was being employed in ways we had never seen before. The fragments weren't just gathering data from Earth's surface. They were scanning the planet's core, tracing mantle flow, identifying density gradients, and mapping the very structure of the Earth. This shift in the neutrino pulses revealed something even more troubling. The fragments weren't just conducting an observational mission. They were gathering detailed, real-time data on the planet's inner workings. It was as if they were learning about Earth's structure, not just its surface features, but its very core, its deepest layers. This wasn't a one-off occurrence. It was systematic, deliberate, and precise. The fragments were analyzing Earth, not as scientists might study a distant planet, but as an entity trying to understand the most intimate workings of its target. By now, the realization had fully dawned on scientists worldwide. The fragments weren't here for a simple visit. They weren't just traveling through our solar system, passing by Earth like a comet or asteroid might. No, these fragments had arrived with purpose, and their purpose was not just observation. They were here to interact with Earth. They were here to study, manipulate, and perhaps even influence the planet in ways humanity could not comprehend. As the fragments entered Earth's upper atmosphere, something remarkable occurred. There were no explosions, no heat, no ion trails. As the fragments reached the exosphere just above the Kármán line, the boundary that marks the start of space, everything seemed to unfold smoothly. The air didn't compress around them. It didn't heat up. There was no violent descent, no blinding flash of light. Instead, the molecules in the atmosphere parted as if an invisible force was gently guiding them aside, leaving no trace of their passage. This phenomenon, known as the Misner-style effect, suggested the presence of a magnetic exclusion field, an unseen force that allowed the fragments to slip through Earth's atmosphere with zero resistance. It was as if they were sliding through the atmosphere, parting the air with no friction. There was no sonic boom, no displacing shock waves, no heat from entry. They simply entered Earth's atmosphere as though they had already synchronized their arrival, bypassing the known physical laws governing atmospheric entry. This wasn't natural. This wasn't how things worked in the known universe. This was confirmation that the fragments were manipulating the very air they passed through, not merely traveling through it. They had synchronized their movements with such precision that their arrival didn't just defy the laws of physics, it defied the very concept of natural, uncontrolled entry. It was as if the objects had anticipated everything, had planned it down to the finest detail. And as they continued their silent descent, a terrifying truth began to emerge. The fragments were not descending randomly. They were aligning themselves over specific tectonic boundaries. This was no longer just about a cosmic object passing by Earth. This was about direct intervention in the planet's natural processes. These fragments weren't just passive objects. They were altering the balance of Earth's systems slowly but surely. Stay tuned as we uncover more about how these objects continue to change the rules of space, physics, and Earth itself. There's more to this mystery than we can begin to imagine, and the next part will reveal even more shocking truths about the fragments' ultimate purpose. As the fragments continued to descend toward Earth, they began to position themselves with alarming precision. The alignment of the fragments wasn't random. They weren't simply falling toward Earth with the usual chaotic descent of natural objects. These fragments were targeting specific, sensitive geological zones, places where the Earth's tectonic plates meet. These are the regions of the planet most vulnerable to seismic activity, where energy builds up and the ground shifts. The fragments weren't just hovering over the planet, they were actively interacting with the tectonic structure of the Earth itself. This strategic positioning over Earth's fault lines, rift valleys, and subduction zones suggested something entirely new. These fragments weren't merely passively observing our planet. They were here to influence Earth's seismic activity, to modulate the tectonic forces at play. If these fragments could subtly influence the local gravity in these regions, they could help regulate earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and other tectonic events. It was as if the fragments were quietly steering Earth's geological processes, keeping them within a controlled range. They were not forcing the planet's systems to act in any one way, but rather preventing them from spiraling out of control. This intervention, however, wasn't just about geology. The entire Earth seemed to be responding to the presence of these fragments. Scientists monitoring Earth's magnetic field began to notice subtle yet undeniable shifts in the planet's ionosphere. The ionosphere, which plays a crucial role in Earth's electromagnetic systems, began to exhibit small but measurable changes in resonance. These shifts were detected by instruments monitoring communication systems, satellite constellations, and even GPS signals. What was truly disturbing, however, was the realization that these shifts were deliberate. The fragments had synchronized themselves with Earth's electromagnetic systems, creating an almost perfect connection between the fragments and the planet's own electrical systems. In the span of a few hours, the fragments had essentially plugged into Earth's communication infrastructure. They had aligned themselves with Earth's electromagnetic environment in a way that no natural object ever could. This wasn't just a casual interaction. The fragments were directly influencing the planet's communications and navigation systems, subtly altering the rhythms that governed life on Earth. The implications of this were profound. What we had once considered the normal functioning of Earth's electromagnetic systems had been quietly adjusted. Earth was no longer functioning solely under its own rules. It was now part of a larger system, one controlled by an intelligence beyond our understanding. At the same time, researchers studying the fragments' gravitational effects were stunned by the precision of their movements. The fragments, despite their size, didn't seem to be influenced by Earth's gravitational forces. The usual forces of attraction between Earth, the Moon, and the Sun should have introduced chaos into the fragments' formation, but they remained perfectly synchronized. There were no signs of gravitational disturbance, no evidence of ion trails, no electromagnetic interference. It was as though the fragments had engineered a shared gravity field between themselves, allowing them to act as one cohesive unit. This shared gravity field, if it existed, would allow the fragments to operate in perfect harmony, overriding the gravitational forces that typically govern objects in space. This concept of a synthetic gravity lattice, an engineered field of gravity that could override natural forces, was something that had only been theorized in advanced physics. Yet, as the fragments moved in perfect coordination, it seemed to be the only plausible explanation. The fragments had created a gravity field between themselves, allowing them to move as a single entity, unaffected by the forces around them. It was a level of control over gravity that we had never imagined possible. Then came another breakthrough. As the first 10 fragments entered the Earth's upper exosphere, an event took place that no one could have predicted. Instead of the expected plasma blooms, shock waves, and radio blackouts that usually accompany high-velocity entry into Earth's atmosphere, the fragments passed through with a smoothness that defied explanation. X-ray observatories recorded something unprecedented. The atmosphere didn't heat up around the fragments. It didn't compress. It didn't even displace violently. The air molecules simply parted as if moved by an invisible force, with no resistance, no friction. It was as though the fragments were gliding through the atmosphere, bypassing every known rule of atmospheric entry. This phenomenon, known as the Misner-style effect, suggested the presence of a magnetic exclusion field, an invisible force that allowed the fragments to slip through Earth's atmosphere with no friction. It was as though the very air around the fragments was being manipulated, allowing them to pass through the atmosphere as if they had already synchronized their descent. This wasn't just a cosmic anomaly. This was a controlled descent, one that couldn't be explained by any known laws of physics. These objects weren't just passing through the atmosphere, they were interacting with it, altering the very nature of how they entered Earth's atmosphere. With each passing minute, the implications of this descent became clearer. The fragments weren't just visiting Earth. They weren't here to simply observe. They were manipulating the planet, altering the very systems that govern Earth's atmosphere, ionosphere, and geophysical processes. They had synchronized their movements with precision that no natural object could replicate. And as they continued their descent, the question remained, what were these fragments trying to achieve? Why were they so perfectly coordinated? What was their true purpose? Stay tuned for the next part, where we will dive deeper into the purpose behind the fragments' arrival and explore what happens when they complete their descent, potentially altering the fate of Earth forever. The mysteries are only just beginning to unfold. As the fragments finally reach the upper reaches of Earth's atmosphere, something even more astonishing occurred. These objects, once mere pieces of debris in space, had become far more than that. They were now behaving in ways that defied everything we knew about planetary systems. The subtle but undeniable interactions they had begun with Earth systems continued to grow in intensity. The fragments, now positioned over key tectonic zones, were not merely passive observers, they were actively manipulating the planet's geophysical systems. Scientists monitoring Earth's electromagnetic fields noticed something that sent a chill down their spines. The fragments, each positioned above critical geological locations, began to influence not just the Earth's magnetic field, but the planet's overall electromagnetic balance. Instruments designed to monitor solar activity and space weather began to detect a decrease in solar storm impacts. It was as though Earth's magnetosphere had been subtly reinforced from above, as if an invisible hand were stabilizing the planet's electromagnetic defenses. The implications of this were profound. Earth's natural systems were being adjusted in real time, not by any human intervention, but by an intelligence beyond our comprehension. The fragments weren't just reducing the impact of solar activity, they were stabilizing Earth's environment. They were essentially acting as cosmic stabilizers, buffering the planet from external forces that could have otherwise caused significant harm. What was even more unsettling, however, was the way the fragments were interacting with Earth's biological systems. Researchers tracking migratory species noticed a striking change in behavior. Whales, birds, and other animals that relied on Earth's magnetic field for navigation were now altering their migratory patterns in ways that were completely unprecedented. Whales were changing their routes with an uncanny consistency, while birds were correcting their flight paths mid-flight, showing an unprecedented precision in their movements. This wasn't just a minor shift. It was as though these creatures were now aligned with a new rhythm, a rhythm that was being set by the unseen presence of the fragments above them. The biological world, it seemed, was adjusting to the fragments' influence. It was as if the entire planet, from its atmosphere to its biosphere, had been subtly realigned by the arrival of these objects. But this wasn't just happening in the natural world. Human systems were beginning to feel the effects as well. Markets, which had been volatile for months, started to stabilize. The erratic fluctuations that had plagued global economies for years seemed to settle, and for the first time in a long while, a sense of calm began to pervade the financial world. However, this stability came at a cost. The uncertainty that had once driven economic forces was now gone. The systems were in place, but they were controlled by something far beyond human influence. On the military front, a new dilemma emerged. The fragments were unlike anything the world had ever seen. They weren't just passive objects drifting through space. They were sentient, intelligent, and capable of influencing Earth's systems. Military leaders, who had long been trained to respond to threats, found themselves with no tangible target to strike. These objects couldn't be destroyed by conventional means. There were no heat signatures, no communication signals, no power sources to disrupt. The fragments were immune to conventional warfare. They weren't here to conquer or destroy. They were simply here, influencing the planet in ways that couldn't be understood or countered. This new reality was a profound shock to humanity. For centuries, we had believed that we controlled the Earth, that we were the masters of our fate. But now, the presence of these fragments had forced us to confront a different truth. We were no longer alone in shaping the future of our planet. The question of who or what had sent these fragments to Earth was still unanswered. But one thing was clear. Earth's fate had been altered, and humanity was no longer in control. This realization sparked a heated debate across the world. On one side, there were those who saw the arrival of the fragments as a blessing. Climate change had slowed, seismic activity had stabilized, and the planet's ecosystems were beginning to show signs of recovery. For these individuals, the fragments represented a kind of cosmic salvation, a force that had come to guide Earth back into balance. On the other side, there were those who saw it as a loss of sovereignty, a subtle form of control imposed on Earth without any consent. These fragments were not just observing Earth, they were regulating it, dictating its behavior in ways that were impossible to understand. As the weeks passed, the influence of the fragments became more pronounced. The subtle shifts in Earth systems, once hard to notice, became impossible to ignore. The weather patterns stabilized, volcanic eruptions were more predictable, and even the stock market began to experience an unprecedented calm. It was as if Earth's systems had fallen into a new rhythm, one that wasn't human-made, but was instead controlled by an intelligence far beyond our comprehension. The question now became, what would humanity do with this new reality? Could we learn to live within the boundaries that the fragments had set? Or would we continue to push against these constraints, risking destabilization and chaos? The presence of the fragments had rewritten the rules of what it meant to exist on Earth. And for the first time in history, humanity had to reckon with the fact that we were no longer the dominant force on our planet. The universe had introduced a new order, one that we would have to navigate if we were to survive. The mystery of the fragments was far from over. But what was becoming clear was that humanity's role in the future of Earth had changed forever. Stay tuned for the final part, where we'll explore the lasting impact of these events and what the future holds for a planet that is no longer in control of its own fate. The conclusion of this mystery will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about Earth's place in the cosmos. Don't miss it. As the fragments hovered above Earth, their presence had now fully transformed the planet's systems. The subtle shifts that began with the first fragment's arrival had evolved into a profound global change. Earth was no longer operating entirely under its own rules. The fragments, seemingly engineered with intelligence far beyond anything humanity had encountered, had synchronized themselves with Earth's systems, creating a new reality, one where the planet's natural order was being shaped and directed by an external cosmic force. The first question that loomed large across the scientific community was no longer what these objects were or where they came from, but why they had come. What was their purpose? The fragments had already demonstrated their ability to influence Earth's electromagnetic systems, regulate seismic activity, and even subtly guide the behavior of migratory species. Their arrival had not been random, it was deliberate, and it seemed to serve a far greater purpose than we could yet comprehend. Scientists, governments, and global institutions struggled to make sense of the situation. The fragments, despite their sheer size and the undeniable impact they had on Earth's systems, had not interfered with human life in any obvious way. There were no hostile actions, no demands, and no direct confrontations. The fragments had arrived, but they had done so with the quiet precision of a force that was simply ensuring balance, order, and stability. In fact, Earth had become a much more stable place since their arrival. Natural disasters, once unpredictable and catastrophic, had been regulated. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and even extreme weather events had become less frequent, more predictable. The ecological systems were stabilizing, and species that had once been on the brink of extinction had started to show signs of recovery. The climate, which had once seemed beyond saving, appeared to have slowed its rapid decline. This was a profound change, and for many it felt like salvation, a kind of cosmic intervention that had saved the planet from the brink of destruction. However, the stability that the fragments brought came at a cost. Humanity was no longer the sole architect of its own fate. The presence of the fragments had imposed a new set of boundaries on the planet, and the question of how humanity would respond to this new reality became the focal point of debates across the world. While some saw the fragments' influence as a blessing, something that had prevented further climate catastrophe and stabilized the planet's systems, others viewed it as an unacceptable loss of autonomy. Earth was no longer free to follow its own path. The fragments had subtly rewritten the rules, introducing constraints that humanity had never been forced to consider before. This shift in the balance of power on Earth had profound philosophical and ethical implications. For centuries, humanity had believed that it was the dominant force on the planet, that we controlled the Earth and its future. But the arrival of the fragments had shattered that illusion. Earth was no longer a place where human actions were the sole drivers of change. The fragments had shown us that there were forces in the universe far beyond our control, forces that could intervene in the planet's systems in ways we could not predict or resist. As the fragments continued to hover above Earth, their influence only grew stronger. It wasn't just about preventing catastrophic events, it was about guiding Earth's systems toward a more balanced, stable state. The forces at play here were so subtle that many didn't realize just how much they had already been altered. The planet's systems had fallen into a new rhythm, one that wasn't dictated by human action, but by the influence of the fragments themselves. The fragments, it seemed, had become the quiet guardians of Earth's stability. They were not conquerors, nor were they invaders. They had not come to dominate Earth, but to ensure that the planet's systems operated within a set of balanced constraints. Earth's fate, it seemed, was now no longer entirely in humanity's hands. The fragments had set the boundaries within which the planet could evolve, and humanity would have to learn to live within them. The final realization came when it became clear that Earth was no longer a solitary entity in the vastness of space. It was now part of a much larger cosmic order, one where the influence of other civilizations or forces was a tangible reality. The question of whether humanity could accept this new reality, this new set of constraints, was now at the forefront of human thought. Would we learn to live within the boundaries set before us? Or would we continue to push against them, risking destabilization and potential disaster? This new age, shaped by the fragments, was not one of domination, but of quiet regulation. It was an age where the laws of nature were no longer the only ones at play. The fragments, with their advanced technology and control over space-time, had shown us that we were not the only intelligence in the universe, and we may never be in control again. The era of unchecked consequence was over. The age of carefully measured progress had begun. As humanity grappled with the presence of the fragments, the question remained, how would we navigate this new reality? Would we embrace this new balance, or would we challenge it, risking everything for the sake of autonomy? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain, the arrival of the fragments had irrevocably changed the course of human history. If you've been fascinated by the mysteries of space, the challenges humanity now faces, and the lessons we must learn to survive in this new reality, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and share it with anyone who is still wondering what lies beyond Earth. Stay tuned for more deep dives into the unknown. The universe has many more secrets to uncover. Join us on this incredible journey